spent a lot of time in Oklahoma. Um,
Come
but
home.
I'm a Texan through and through. But Oklahoma's kind of, I mean, it's like a brother to Texas, I guess. I guess we can claim that. But appreciate you guys. Let's just jump right into it. I want to talk really about one thing, and that is culture. Um, so culture is the number one thing that if you spend time building, it'll do all the heavy lifting for you. And that's because culture is something that we can't escape. Culture is the number one discipleship force in the world. It's why the book of Leviticus is so weird, is because it's centered around God giving Israel their culture that's going to make them, or supposed to make them, a distinct people. Um, so culture, whatever your church's culture is going to either amplify your efforts or undermine your efforts. So how do we understand culture? Because culture is really something that we kind of take for granted when we think of revitalizing a church, or even, kind of installing evangelistic fervor in our members. And so, well, what is culture? Well, when I think of church revitalization, I think of it as it's an assessment of our church culture and an intentional realignment with the gospel. The gospel is good news for all people. That's what the angels told the shepherds. I believe that. And so I don't believe that there's any person that the gospel is not good news for. My job is to partner with God to communicate the gospel in a culturally understandable way so that they can hear what God has done for them in Jesus and be transformed by it. Right. And so culture really simply is the story of our community. So culture is to tell a different story is the fastest way to change culture. People, I don't know if you've heard this, pastors, but people will say, oh, cultural change takes a long time. I don't actually, I mean, it could, sure. But I never believed that, because you'll look at, I mean, you'll look at CEOs that come into companies and immediately install a new culture. And as they install this new culture, the company starts to become successful. Um, so, it's really the fastest way to change culture, because you can change it at an exponentially faster rate than many people will say, is really just through the power of telling a better story. And the way that you look at what is the story your church is telling itself is really to look at, what do you celebrate and what do you criticize? When you
Hey,
celebrate something,
Luke,
yeah,
pause 1 second, man. Pause, rewind, and play again. What did you just
pause.
say?
I said,
Yeah.
the number one way that you can assess your church's culture is by what you criticize and what you celebrate. So if you celebrate baptisms like hugely, that's going to shape the culture of your church. If you criticize other neighboring churches, or if you have members who criticize other neighboring churches, that's going to impact your church culture. So, what is the story of your church? What is the story that your church is telling itself? What is the story that your church is telling itself about the community around it? These are going to shape the way that you disciple, the way that you're discipled through culture. Now, there's a great book. It's called To Change the World by James Davison Hunter. He's a conservative sociologist from the University of Virginia. And he said this. He says, culture is the structure of society's commonly held assumptions that the world is this way, so people should respond that way. It's these assumptions that we tend to just take for granted, but it's what conditions us to really live a particular way. One of the cultural narratives is, if you haven't moved out of your home by your 30s, you've failed to launch. And so,
Verse.
because of that, we go to college, right, or we go to a trade school. We settle down and find a partner, and we become financially independent, and that's the good life. And that's a cultural narrative, right? And so that's built up or propped up in America by some commonly held assumptions that that's being successful, right? And so people respond in a particular way. And he continues, and he He says, how is it sustained? Well, it's sustained not by this set of propositions, but it's embedded within narratives and myths that often reinforce these common ideals. So here he is. He has traced how Christianity was able to shape a lot of the world and how it's lost a lot of its influence. And he goes back and says, man, it's because there was this cultural dynamic in the early church that was sustained by stories. And so, stories, to be able to assess stories in your local church and to communicate a better story, is actually going to have an exponentially more powerful impact in changing your church's culture than you'll ever possibly think of. Um, because culture is so distinct, I have to talk a little bit about how we tend to respond to a changing world, because we live in a world where there's two problems that are going to affect us as pastors and affect our churches. And the problems are the problem of difference, meaning what happens when somebody who is not like us shows up to church from a different culture, and dissolution, which is what happens when terms used to have specific meaning but have changed because the way that culture uses them now is distinct or is different from its original use. This is why you, as a pastor, could have church members that say the same things but really mean completely different things because they come from different cultures, and so they think that they're saying the same thing, but they're actually not at all. So these are the two problems, because our churches are incredibly culturally diverse, whether or not it's made up of many different ethnic cultures, like the church that I had, one of my churches that I had in New Zealand, because I had the main constituent church and then I had a church plant. But even because of technological advancement, they're coming from many different silos of culture online. And so they're still being conditioned, even if they're of the same kind of ethnic background, from different worlds, because their algorithm is creating their own world within it, right? And so how do we respond to the difference and dissolution, right? So we've normally had three responses. Christianity, most Christian churches, first response is the defense against posture, meaning we believe that anything that's different is dangerous. And so the story that we tell ourselves is that we have to put these walls up. The main problem in this story is secularization, the removal of religious ideas from the public arena. And so anything that's different is seen as dangerous. So purple haired guest shows up to your church, walks into the foyer, and immediately it's like not somebody to be celebrated of welcome. We're so glad you're here. Wow, what a step of courage to walk into your church, to walk into church. It's who is this person? Why are they here? What are they coming to do? Are they coming in with an agenda? Like, that's a defense against posture, and that's from a story that your church might be believing. Now, this is the defense against posture is largely the story and the response that most evangelical churches follow. I've pastored a lot of churches where this is the belief. The main church I pastored in New Zealand, main constituent conference church, I oversaw 40% of the conference membership wise. And I walked in as the young adult, pastor. I'm the lead pastor, but I'm a young adult, and I walk in and it spent 11 minutes before I was greeted. This was, historically not a very warm church. Average age was 60 and up. We were right next to, like, literally within walking distance of a university campus, a large university campus, third largest in the country. And yet our growth was not evangelistic. It was often membership transfer. And people would celebrate that, right? Because our tribe was becoming more like us. We were finding our people, and we were just going to be against anything that was different from that. And so I would regularly have church members who would critique other Adventist churches. And that was because they were different than us. And so we needed to make sure that we didn't get co-opted into their worldliness, with air quotes, right? And that's because our story was really more so in line with this defense against posture. Another kind of story is this relevant towards, which the main problem is keeping the church relevant. And this is a self-defeating story, because to maintain relevance, we water down and eliminate any of our differences or distinctiveness. And so by trying to be relevant, we become irrelevant, because we say there's nothing really that's distinct about us, which means that we can't actually help in any way, shape, or form, because there's nothing special. There's nothing that we have to offer. We're just trying to stick in with the crowd. This is, some of these church growth churches follow this posture. We sometimes think like, oh, if we just have trendier worship music, or maybe a trendier facility, that'll be what helps us. But I actually found that unchurched people don't really care what songs you sing, as long as you love them and will help them experience in Jesus. But relevant towards, this is largely a response to the defense against posture. So the people who experience the relevant towards story or posture are largely kids whose parents were the defense against ones. And then there's a third story, and that's purity from. Main problem is keeping the church pure from the world, and any difference seen is seen as darkness. And so we want to remove ourselves. That's why we might go and live out in the middle of nowhere, not have any neighbors, so that we can maintain a sense of purity from the corrupt world. These are three common storylines that exist in churches, and they are deeply problematic. And if we don't install or partner with the Holy Spirit in creating a better Christ-centered, gospel-empowered culture, these three cultures will take over your church. They probably already exist there in some shape or form. And you can see what they are by what you celebrate and what you criticize. If you celebrate being like, we're in the right and everyone else is in the wrong, then that could be potentially a defense against posture. If we celebrate like how we're becoming, more more trendy, right? We're becoming more modern, which could be a positive thing, right? Could be good. Sometimes we need to make that adjustment and enter what is going on currently. But it could be, okay, we're being the relevant towards, right? Or if we're just holding on. I mean, one of the churches that was near me hadn't had a baptism in forever, had dwindled down to 7 members, and they were happy because they had doctrinal purity, because they were existing as the purity from posture or story. But yeah, James Davison Hunter, he comes up with a brilliant conclusion that is really quite simple, and it's what you can do as the pastor, because you're not hopeless here. And that is the power of faithfully living out the gospel story. So he basically says the power of incarnation, being the embodiment of culture, of the kingdom of God, will change things. So these are his words: the practice of faithful presence then generates relationships and institutions, which would be a local church, that are fundamentally covenantal in character, the ends of which are purpose, truth, beauty, belonging, and fairness, not just for Christians, but for everyone. And so living out a better story, telling this better story of what Jesus is really about, of what Jesus celebrates, of how Jesus would reach people, of how Jesus, 3 times we're told that the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. The Son of Man came to give his life a ransom, and the Son of Man came eating and drinking. And that's profound, because it shows us what Jesus was embodying. And we're told that as the Father sent Jesus, so I send you, he says to his disciples. Jesus told stories. He spoke of parables. He spoke in parables. And it's because that's how he would change the culture of his community, by faithfully living within that story that he was telling, and to tell it to others, right? So here's a couple of examples of what this looks like. So when I walked into church, this is a picture of my family. You'll see that there is a sign above the door. Okay. It says, "Reverence my sanctuary." Now, I'm all about reverence. I'm a hockey player by trade. You do not step on the center logo in the locker room. You don't. It's irreverent in hockey communities. Reverence my sanctuary. I understand what that idea is, The problem is that culturally that was an icon that reinforced come in and be quiet in this church. But the
Mhm.
problem is that's not the story that we actually want to be telling, because we don't live in a kind of puritanistic come in and be absolutely silent. Like, what happens if you have to cough? What happens if a child starts to cry? What happens if your child starts to cry and you can't rush them out super fast, right? Like, things happen. And so this sign actually was a narrative as soon as you walk in the door of, here's one of our main values. Now, can we just, I mean, I'll go out on a limb here and basically say, this is not actually God's sanctuary. This is a place of worship, because his sanctuary, according to the New Testament, is us. And so to reverence God's sanctuary is actually to love who God purchased in his own blood above yourself. So this sign had been attempted to be changed. This church had had a average tenure of a local church pastor of a year. I got my church board to vote unanimously in 5 minutes to take this sign down after 6 months of being there. And it was because we were telling a much better story of, we had we wanted to focus on our kids ministries, so we changed our signage in our foyer to celebrate and put up pictures of pathfinders and adventurers, of pictures of generic kids, none of our kids. But we had outlined, the progression of growth, leadership growth there. So as soon as you walk in, boom, there it is. We had, how do you get involved? Boom, there it is. We had, pictures of baptisms, of church member baptisms, and it was next to our next steps, kind of flow chart, because we wanted to use signage to reinforce the story that we were telling about what God was calling us to be. We eliminated criticism of other churches. I started praying for our other churches up front. I started to cast the vision that we're part of a global movement. And so we're praying for the churches across the world, as people walk into these churches, that they would experience the transformation that only comes through the work of the Holy Spirit. And so we started to celebrate and cast this larger story. And eventually we changed the sign to, instead of reverence my sanctuary, a house of prayer for all people.
Amen.
Because that's a better story. And so when we voted, it wasn't on, oh, Pastor, we're doing away with reverence, because I said, cool, I'll preach a sermon on reverence. Like, what, we can focus on reverence. We don't need a sign to tell us to be reverent. And so we bam, right here, we told a better story. As soon as you walk in, here's our better story: a house of prayer for all people. We had 7 different foreign language, non-English speaking Sabbath school classes. Um, like, we advertised that. We did English, as a second language, kind of, we gave up our classrooms during the week to help people learn English, right? Because we had church members who were taking these courses. And so this says, not only are they welcome, but also their friends that might come and visit them are welcome. New Zealand is even more of a diverse place than we tend to think of. We started to have this thing called, basically, when a baptism would happen, we would, Friday night, I'd get all the elders and influential leaders, and we would have a meal for the baptismal candidate, and we would just celebrate them. We would talk about ways that we've seen God at work in their lives. And then the spouses, the partner who wasn't gender specific. So if a girl was getting baptized, it was all the elder wives and deaconesses, Pathfinder leaders that were female, and they would stay and they would get in a circle and they would share a lesson they've learned in following Jesus since their baptism. And we would make Friday night such a celebration of what was going to be happening Sabbath morning, that we started to have so many people show up to these things because they just wanted to participate in celebrating. And it was tremendous, hearing these stories. We're starting to celebrate changed lives. We started to celebrate our young people. This was a church that didn't have a youthful presence. In New Zealand, youth ministries is is young adult ministries, and which is funny because 18 to 35, there's a lot of change of life that happens there. But we started a Friday night hangout, and we immediately saw God do some tremendous things. And we started to just cast the vision of how our church needs to exist for future generations if God does not come back. If Jesus doesn't come, our church needs to continue to exist. So we need to start to empower young people to lead. And so by doing this, more young people started to hear this story that this is a place for you. And they started to come to church, and they started to bring their friends. And in this picture, I have several non-Adventists that are just there. They're just being brought by their friends. And we would then advertise, here's what's been happening, on Friday nights in our church, up front, Sabbath morning. And so, we just really leaned into what is the story that we want to tell? What is the story that God is asking us to tell? Instead of what's the story that we're just letting the loudest person in the room tell?
Mm.
Um, what
Mm.
what is the what's the story that exists as soon as somebody walks in here? We did a facility walkthrough where, what does our facility tell us about who we are? What does the way that our service mirror who we are? Does the flow of the worship, reflect the story that we're telling? What components do we, what do we put up front shows what we value, right? So it says a lot about the story that we are allowing to exist of our community, of what God is doing through us. And so we started to refine, well, who's up front and what does that look like? And yeah, we talked about dress code so that we were on the same page, because we wanted to be intentional about the story that we were living out. And y'all, can I say that this is one of the craziest things is we took, they'll say that a church, we had baptisms. We had, so many stories of baptisms. We baptized, indigenous New Zealanders. So we baptized Maori, which is one of the hardest to reach demographics in the world. We baptized non-English speaking, Koreans, non-English speaking Brazilians, where we sometimes didn't even have translators. We baptized young people who had, never really even heard anything about God. We started to become more relevant to the university up the street, all by just myself embodying and us constantly proclaiming this better story of what God was doing. And one of the fundamental points that I kept stressing is we're part of a global movement, which means that until the whole world is saturated by the love of Jesus, we have failed. And so we need to mobilize to reach the whole world. And so what does that look like? And we talked about church planting. We talked about how we could get more people into Bible studies. We talked about, having YouTube playlists of our sermon series. We talked about a whole litany of things. And lo and behold, this church that was kind of had planted a church out of, a convenience of COVID. We saw them become missional, and now they're planting a church strategically by raising up a core group of leaders, their best leaders, into a area that is incredibly unreached, all because they caught the vision of an intentional story that we exist to reach the world in Jesus' name. And it radically transformed the culture of this church to where we became warm, loving, and energetic for Jesus.